Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to the 30th episode of A Couple Takes on MS. Hi, this is Dan Digman.
And hi, I'm Jennifer Digman. And we're here today on the MS&Me Radio Network, and we wanted to talk to you about our recent trip to Washington, D.C.
And I think this is the big thing with our trip to D.C. was for advocating and advocacy for issues for multiple sclerosis. We were there, we were part of a group of more than 300 activists from nationwide on Capitol Hill advocating for and meeting with our legislators to encourage them to support and pass legislation that would benefit all of us living with multiple sclerosis here in the United States.
And as Dan and I have spoken with you in the past, we think advocacy is very important, and it's a really empowering way to get involved. Either if you are living with multiple sclerosis or you're a caregiver for someone living with MS, advocacy is a great way to reclaim any power you've lost because of the disease. And it's something we really enjoy, and it's really important to mention that being involved as an advocate can be scary, or it can seem scary, but these legislators work for you, work for us. They really want to hear our opinion. And when there are 300 advocates, as Dan mentioned, in a place like Washington, D.C., all of us wearing our orange, we are very powerful. And we are a force to not be ignored, and we were getting our point across that day. So that's why Dan and I wanted to talk to you about some of the issues. We met with legislators from our home state of Michigan, but as he mentioned, all 50 states had some advocates and activists working to meet with their legislators.
And I think that's the thing, we talked about advocacy when we were there earlier in the month of March, but advocacy knows no dates, no time, and really what we'll highlight some of the issues, and I'll just say it out loud now. Go to the National MS Society website and look under the Get Involved topic or the button on there, and that'll have the drop down so you too can reach out to your legislators to advocate for these issues. And we'll just highlight just an overview of them.
And that's an important point you made, Dan. You don't have to go to Washington, D.C. or to your state capital to be considered an advocate or an activist. You can write letters, make phone calls. Heck, you can go to the National MS Society's website, and they'll basically give you a Cliff Notes version of an issue that's important at that moment. And so you'll have all the information there. And it really makes advocacy much easier. And as Dan's going to talk to you about some of the issues we talked about, the MS Society gave us great notes and really informed us about the issues and gave us an opportunity to say why it was important in our lives. Because as you remember, both Dan and I are living with multiple sclerosis, and that's why this advocacy work is so important. So sorry about that, babe. I just had to jump in.
No, and I needed you to jump in because you made good points just
Why,
to clarify.
thank you.
Well, and you always do, and so always jump in. And
All right.
and if I'm really talking something that important, I'll cut you back off. And
Why,
so,
thank you, yes.
Well, and here then are just a highlight of, and we'll go into a little more detail on each of them, but just kind of top it off. We talked about encouraging our legislators to sign a Dear Colleague letter that will support $12 million for the multiple sclerosis research programs that will help to fill the gaps of funding for high impact, high risk, high gain projects. And these are things that go beyond funding through the National Institutes of Health, the NIH funding. This was funding specifically for MS research. Another one is to provide $5 million for the National Neurological Condition Surveillance System at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Essentially, what that's doing is helping to track the number of cases of multiple sclerosis nationwide so that we can get a better handle on the specific numbers of people living with MS. Where are these numbers? Where is this happening?
And that was a really, that neurological condition surveillance data is really important because we ask our legislators, we met someone, do you know how many people in your district are living with multiple sclerosis? And if you're an honest representative or member of the government, he or she would probably say, no, I have no idea. And we'd say, yeah, well, we don't either because the data that has been collected is so old. It was collected in the 70s. And, in that 40 years, so much has changed. So that's why that data was so important.
And another area that we talked about was just to pass bipartisan legislation that would stabilize individual health insurance markets. So we all, whether you have multiple sclerosis or not, we as Americans know how big of an issue healthcare is for us living, especially with multiple sclerosis.
Those of us living with chronic disease. But it's so important to stabilize and make health insurance more readily available. And really, when any legislator we met with, when we brought up this issue, they all nodded their heads and they know that needs to be happening, that there needs to be stabilization of the marketplace. But it was really good to just chime in our 2 cents worth that it's really important for people living with a chronic condition like MS.
And as long as we're talking about the access to quality health care, another thing that's really big for those of us living with multiple sclerosis is what we pushed was to encourage our legislators to pass a slate of legislation that will make medications more affordable and the process of getting them more simple and transparent. Now, we living with multiple sclerosis know far too well that our medicines, our disease-modifying therapies are incredibly expensive. And so what can we, I'm pushing like $90,000 a year just for our disease-modifying therapies. So we're just like, what can you do as our elected officials to help rein in these costs of medication? And then the final issue that we had talked about was just to prioritize federal investments in MS research. We talked earlier then as far as like the funding for MS research, but it's just like, how do we get this so we can push and have the research continue to move forward aggressively for this disease?
And that was a great overview of the 5 issues that we were in Washington advocating for. But now if, we look at them a little more closely, you can see how they will all impact our lives.
And I think that's a big thing. And again, go to the National MS Society website because there's all kinds of detailed information on this. And the most important thing is then how you, as people out there, how you can get involved. Even if you don't know who your legislator is, it will tell you, and that way you can get more involved in doing this. I think that was the most empowering thing, is to go to D.C. and not on several of our legislators were I don't want to say first name basis with them, but it's just like that they recognize us, and that's very empowering. They can understand what we're talking about. And I think the big thing, one of the things was for the multiple, they use acronyms all the time in Washington, D.C. So it's like the MRSP is the multiples, or the
MSRP.
Yeah,
You said it a little backwards, which I understand, but it's the MSRP.
Yes, the multiple sclerosis research program. It's part, and this is the one of the things that the Congress established the MSRP in 2009, and it has broad bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, and it's just everything is so big, and it's just like we really need to get the research specifically for multiple sclerosis.
Because there is, I can't exactly cite exact numbers, but when I was meeting with the self-help group in my hometown, there were 3 members of the self-help group that were former military, and all 3 of them had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And in a small support group, which mine was, 3 people out of 20 had MS, and it makes you start to wonder, what is the connection? And then when you start wondering about like the military connection, and then for people like me who are living with secondary progressive MS, is there funding for researching more progressive forms of the disease? And that's why this MSRP, this multiple sclerosis research program, is so important.
And it's funded through this particular program, as you had indicated, it's funded through the Department of Defense, and that's where really it's about so much more than just multiple sclerosis. It's pulling in all of these communities that benefit from it, and so this was a big one because we are so close. Not that I don't want to say that we're close to. Obviously closer to finding a cure than we were when you and I were diagnosed like nearly 20 years ago.
Right.
But I think it's just the research that's done to help. My big push is wanting for the repairing of damage that's already been done. And so I think this is where this research can really come into play.
And if I remember correctly, we had talked about some funding, and I don't exactly remember what piece of legislation, but the funding would help neurological conditions. So it's not just funding to help MS, but it's important for people living with Parkinson's, people with Alzheimer's. And I really believe that someday when an advance is made in MS therapy or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, it could have potential to snowball, and other neurological conditions will be affected. And so that's why it's so important to form like a coalition, if it hasn't happened. Just strengthen numbers, get these neurological conditions working together to get more funding from the government and from the national, the Institute of Health or something like that. Don't you think?
And that's, that builds kind of ties then in from that research that is kind of connected. That's where there was also when we talked about the National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System, because with all of these neurological diseases like MS, like Parkinson's and everything, there's nothing that's tracking all of that. And that's what the $5 million for this comes in. Currently, MS incidence and prevalence are not consistently reported or tracked by the U.S. government. And there was last year, the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed in 2016, said $5 million for this surveillance, but it was never, the funding was never appropriated or never provided for. So really it was just the money's already been, or the concept already has been approved. We just need the money to do that.
We need the money, absolutely. And so much of this is financial and money related, but when we are living with multiple sclerosis, it's easy for the population to think they're not getting the attention that it deserves. And I think that's why the power of the 300 advocates on Capitol Hill, just to say, look, we are a force to be reckoned with, and we want your money, we want your attention, we want your research. So that was pretty powerful. I really think there's just strength in those numbers.
And that's where, when we talk 300, I mean, this nation is so huge, and this is where we all need to get involved. And so that's where your voice will matter, especially when you're talking to your legislators.
And it's important to share your story. Dan and I harp on this. I feel almost like we just beat this to the ground, but it's important to share your story because multiple sclerosis affects each person differently. But you may share something in your story that will really stick with the legislator, where they will want to continue working really hard to increase funding, or just sharing your story so that they know members of their constituency are living with a chronic illness like MS. So your story has power, and that's the first step to get going with advocacy, is sharing your story and then reaching out to legislators.
And that's where, it doesn't, obviously, I guess it does matter, Republican, Democrat, but it's just, we have senators, we have representatives who are both, we have Republican and Democratic, and I think it's not so much where they stand as much as like getting your story out there, and that's where the biggest thing that was pushed for us as MS activists and advocates is sharing your story. I mean, we have our story, but I mean, think of what your story is out there. I mean, what is your story? How you were diagnosed? What surprised you? What are you dealing with? And it's like, those are the things that stick with them.
And how does that impact your family? How does that impact your workplace or your friends? I mean, it's a powerful piece of information. And that really, it made us feel more powerful knowing that the members of the government want to hear our story. And it's really interesting how accessible the members of government are. Just if you hop on the internet, hop on the MS website, just to see, that they are a phone call or an email away. And you will get responses, and maybe you won't always get the movement by the government in the way you hoped, but at least you'll know that you tried. And that's where I think really, I don't want to be Pollyanna, but knowing that you tried and that you're trying to sway a legislator's opinion or make a difference, it makes you feel powerful, and you know that you have an impact. Because living with this disease, I don't walk anymore, so I could potentially feel like, oh, ho hum, where's my strength, or what's my contribution to society. But then if I do something, even on a small scale, with my government, or to better my country or my county or even just my community, that makes me feel powerful. And that's something that we all need to reclaim if we have lost it because of the disease.
Well, and it's just, I think, a matter of starting out, making that initial contact, getting to know the legislators. I think that's where we can talk over blah blah blah, and our legislators recognize us just by our appearance.
And we're fortunate that we live in a smaller community where we have those legislators, half an hour away to the capital of the state, or 45 minutes away to the office of our congressman. That's lucky, but even if you live in a larger state or a larger city, reach out, make those phone calls, and just don't quit. Be persistent. And really, I remember the first time we went to a state action day, and I'm at a state action day at the state capitol, and I was so nervous. And just to meet with legislators and to meet with our state senator or a representative, and I was just, chattering and chatty Cathy because I'm nervous. But it is true, those people work for you, with you, and they want to hear your story. And so on a small scale, if you want to call a state government small scale, go to the state government, and one day maybe you'll be able to go to the national, go to the Capitol, go to Washington, D.C., and make your voice heard there. Even if you don't have the opportunity to go, you can still make your voice heard through the internet or over the telephone, through letters, things like that.
Well, and they track these things. You know, you write a letter to your representative, let's just say.
Yeah.
Write a letter
Yes,
to your
we'll say.
representative. That's in their system, so then when you follow up with a phone call, with another email, they know, they recognize you from that, and just have that one face-to-face meeting with them. Send a thank you, and that's always the big thing. Send a thank you, just because that gives an opportunity for you to reiterate, rehash what it was you talked about, and do more convincing to say, this is why we really need you to do this. And the reality is, they're not going to agree with you every time. They're not going to vote your way every time. But if you can establish that dialogue, build that relationship with them, and there's one of our representatives, one of our legislators, isn't always going to see us eye to eye on things because it's not where his party stands, and we get that, but we can continue to encourage that, because then when there are other issues, he'll recognize multiple sclerosis, recognize us as, and that's the thing, they represent you. Like Jennifer said, they work for you. They're not there without your votes. So just continuing, but always be cordial, always be kind, always be, what's the word?
Appreciative, and always be thankful, and like Dan said, never underestimate the power of a thank you note. But I don't want to just make this sound like our trip to Washington, D.C. that we made during MS Awareness Month. By the way, I hope you had a good MS Awareness Month and you were able to really get the word out about it. But while we were there, we had fun. You know, we were in Washington, D.C. We were with all these other advocates that know how to have a good time. And we had some really, really powerful moments.
And I think that's the big thing. It's like, for as much as we go and tell stories or share our story, we want to hear other people's stories. And Jennifer, you had a great one, and you just never know when this will hit. So we were going from the Senate side to the House side, and if we didn't know this, apparently, well, there is a tunnel under the Capitol that connects the House side to the Senate side. And the one thing was, they said, talk to your senators, and have them have one of their interns escort you. You had an incredible moment with an intern.
We had, because
We
you
did,
were there.
absolutely.
There was this tour group of us, and we were walking from the Senate over to the House, and the tour guide was incredibly friendly and incredibly cordial, and really interested in why we were there. And when we said MS, we ended up talking, because it's an incredibly long distance from one side to the other. But by the end of the tour, he stopped and he said, by the way, my mom has recently been diagnosed with MS. And he opened up his heart, and he told us he's a little afraid, and we talked and just shared our stories, but he shared his story with us. Dan and I were telling him, like, use this resource, reach out here, reach out here. By the end of it, we were exchanging information, and he gave me a hug before we left. And had we not been there in that moment, we may not have gotten to meet this young man whose mother was living with multiple sclerosis. And it was a great trip to DC, but that was among the most powerful, memorable moments for me. Just that, because of this silly disease, which is not always silly, but just because of this disease, I had a man open up and tell me about his family, to talk and share his concerns and fears, and likewise to hear mine about multiple sclerosis. And that was pretty incredible.
I mean, that was a great moment, because everyone else from the group he was escorting from one side to the other, they had left and went about their business, but we stood there and talked with him probably for a good 4 or 5 minutes, and he had to get back to his office.
Yeah.
But he was there, he was engaged, and I think that was big. And I think one of my memorable moment was,
please.
there were a couple, but we had the opportunity to do the Facebook Live for the National MS Society us with 3 other MS activists from Michigan. After we met with our senator, the aide for Senator Gary Peters, we sat outside his office and did a Facebook Live for the entire National MS Society. And that was pretty powerful and pretty heady to be able to be there with other Michigan activists to share our story and explain what we were doing and why this is so important. And we wanted to carry through with that today to talk with you on our show, just to say, get involved. There's lots of things, and advocacy isn't limited to Washington, D.C. and activists. You too can be an MS activist.
And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. And we want to wish you a happy Easter. We hope you had a great holiday, or you are in the midst of having a great holiday. And again, we hope you had a wonderful MS Awareness Month. Thank you for listening today. Remember to be out there and be an advocate.
And thank you all. And again, go to the National Multiple Sclerosis Society website and look on, I believe it's like Get Involved, and look for the advocacy, because that will have everything that you need to know about what we talked about today. And you can get on like the MS Action Alert, and they'll send you emails every time there's something new to talk about. And reach out to us. Find us on our website at danandjenniferdigman.com, or go on Twitter. It's at danjendig. Text us. Let us know what it is you're doing, how you're involved with this. But thank you again for taking the time to listen to our show, and hopefully it gave you some information you can use. And until next time, this is Dan Digman
And Jennifer Digman.
and this is A Couple Takes on MS on the MS&Me Radio Network. And thanks to the network, and also thanks to Blue Draft Kid for composing the theme music for our show. Until next time, take care.